The Bay of Pigs was a significant event in U.S. history that was sparked by the fear of communism in the 1950s and 60s. I'm going to start out by giving you a general outline of the Bay of Pigs invasion. So it was the U.S.'s attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba in 1961. The U.S. invaded the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in response to the threat of the Soviet Union's communist influence over Cuba. In the end, the mission failed, and the blame rested on President Kennedy. You will see this timeline several times, and I'm going to go through each significant event shown, starting with Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba in 1959. Castro's biggest threat to the United States was the connection he was making with the communist Soviet Union. The U.S. was more concerned about the threats from the Soviet Union at this time. If the Soviets were to join with Cuba, then Cuba's close location, which is less than 500 miles from the U.S., would make the communist power a very real problem in the Western Hemisphere. In addition to the communist threats of the Soviet and Cuban government, the U.S. did not trust Castro's actions in general, especially as the U.S. watched him build a more nationalistic country with an anti-American reform. He also took control over the U.S. companies in Cuba. So this leads to the next event on our timeline. Before JFK took office, the Eisenhower administration authorized the CIA to plan a way to end Castro's regime and stop the spread of communist influence in the Western Hemisphere. His administration came up with a loose plan to have the CIA train Cuban exiles for an invasion on their homeland. They hoped it would give the U.S. an advantage, having the forces familiar with Cuba. The U.S. thought that an invasion of 1,400 troops would end in a victory over Castro and a good lasting relationship between Cuba and the United States would form. We will see that this did not happen. Mainly because the Cuban intelligence informed Castro of the guerrilla training camps in Guatemala 6 months prior to the invasion, so they had a heads up about this. This is a picture of some of the Cuban exiles used by the U.S. for this mission. And this was all done before Kennedy came into office, so the loose plans made in 1960 by the Eisenhower administration were then transferred as President Kennedy's responsibilities when he was elected in 1961. As soon as JFK came into office, he was pressured to carry through with the plans for the invasion of Cuba, even though Kennedy and his advisors knew that this small mission had little chance of success against Castro's revolutionary forces. The operations were already poorly managed, so the transition into JFK's presidency would not improve the likelihood of a successful invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was to be initiated on April 17, 1961. Cuba was informed of the mission 6 months prior, so the U.S. was at a great disadvantage. 1,400 U.S. invaders were sent to the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, shown on the map here. Landing on the shore, the troops had no source of protection. And as you can see in the second photo, there were no sources of shelter, and they also did not have enough weapons to defend themselves for the invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion only lasted for 3 days because Castro's forces were prepared, while the U.S. stood with no defense. 80% of the invaders were either killed or captured in this short amount of time. The U.S. really didn't stand a chance at this point. The picture shows the magazine cover from a 1960s pointing out the heartbreaking price Americans had to pay for the U.S. government's miscalculations and improper planning for this invasion. The prisoners of war were kept for 60 months until Kennedy negotiated their release with Castro. They came to an agreement with the U.S.'s gift of $53 million worth of baby food and medicine. Even though the Bay of Pigs was not really Kennedy's plan, he still took full responsibility for the failed invasion. If the invasion did anything, it strengthened Castro's power in Cuba. Kennedy continued to fight the spread of communism, even though the Bay of Pigs failed. I won't discuss much about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but know that this is the next major event where Cuba is a threat to the United States because of their communist ties with the Soviet Union. Overall, the Bay of Pigs invasion did not improve the U.S.'s position in Cuba. Rather, it strengthened Castro's power and turned many Cuban Americans against Kennedy.